The first transmission drifted into a Japanese listening post on a humid morning in 1943. At first, the operators assumed it was another routine American message, clipped, coded, predictable. But as the signal sharpened through the static, they froze. The voice was clear, fast, and confident. Every syllable rang with purpose, and yet not a single word made sense. It was as if the Americans had begun speaking in a language no one in Asia had ever heard. The recording was rushed to Tokyo with a rare sense of urgency. Officers in the Signals Bureau gathered around the reel, replaying the message again and again. To them, this transmission carried the weight of danger. It did not resemble any Allied cipher they had encountered. It did not fragment into recognizable patterns. It simply moved, smooth, human, and impenetrable. They feared the Americans had unveiled a breakthrough machine, something capable of weaving meaning into noise faster than any code analyst could unspool it. In quiet rooms lit by green lamps, Japan's best mathematicians began their work. They charted phonetic clusters, counted repetitions, and compared fragments to every known linguistic family. Cryptanalysts fed the message through mechanical sorters, looking for symmetry or rhythm, anything that might widen a crack in the mystery. But every method failed. The transmission resisted them with an almost mocking elegance. Across the intelligence community, rumors began to spread. Some officers claimed the Allies had built a device that could rearrange speech beyond recognition. Others believed the Americans had abandoned traditional codes entirely, venturing into a new realm of wartime communication. The uncertainty struck harder than the theory itself. For the first time since the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese intelligence faced an Allied message they could not touch. What none of these analysts knew was that the answer lay not in technology, but in people. On islands scattered across the Pacific, a small cadre of young Marines spoke a language carried through generations of oral memory, a language the world had never learned to decipher. And as Tokyo struggled to understand the sound itself was already reshaping the war in ways they had not yet imagined. By early 1942, American commanders confronted a crisis that cut deeper than any battlefield setback. Their coded messages, once believed secure, were being unraveled by Japanese cryptologists within hours. What should have been protected plans became open maps in enemy hands. The war in the Pacific, already defined by distance and uncertainty, now carried a silent imbalance that threatened every operation. The consequences were immediate and painful. During the early defense of the Philippines, entire movements of men and material were anticipated before they unfolded. Commanders watched their positions collapse, not merely under force, but under foreknowledge. Intercepted communications handed the Japanese a clarity the Americans could not match, and each lost foothold made the gap wider. The air seemed to thicken with doubt, as if every transmission carried an echo of betrayal. In the field, officers began to avoid their radios altogether. Some relied on runners, young soldiers threading their way through jungle or coastline with handwritten orders sealed against sweat and rain. Every mile they traveled cost time. Every hour they lost changed the rhythm of battle. Yet to speak openly across the airwaves felt more dangerous still. The war became slower, heavier, and far more costly. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy sharpened its advantage. Its mastery of code-breaking added an invisible weight to its early war dominance. From the Coral Sea to Burma, commanders acted with a confidence rooted in knowledge, not guesswork. They believed they understood the Americans not only tactically, but mathematically. And in many ways, they did. Within American cryptologic units, the pattern became unmistakable. Traditional methods, cipher wheels, transposition systems, mathematical substitutions, could not outrun the skill and persistence of Japanese analysts. Every time a new code appeared, it survived only briefly before cracking. The race was no longer between armies, but between minds. And so, the search began, quietly at first, then with growing urgency. If the United States hoped to regain its footing, it would need something fundamentally different, something no known formula could predict, no machine could reconstruct. But the answer would not emerge from a laboratory. It was waiting somewhere far beyond the boundaries of conventional cryptography. In the first months of 1942, when American cryptologists were struggling to keep pace with a war that moved faster than their ciphers, an unexpected figure stepped forward: Philip Johnston, a civilian engineer and the son of missionaries who had spent his childhood on Navajo lands, arrived at a Marine Corps base carrying an idea so unusual that officers assumed it belonged to rumor rather than strategy. He spoke quietly, almost academically, as he explained that the Navajo language possessed a structure unlike any known tongue, complex, unwritten, and spoken fluently by only a small community in the American Southwest. In his view, it was not merely a language, it was a natural code. The officers listened with polite skepticism. To them, the suggestion bordered on naive. Modern cryptanalysis had turned languages into puzzles solvable by pattern and frequency. Surely no spoken system, however rare, could resist determined mathematical study. They thanked Johnston for his enthusiasm, prepared to dismiss the proposal, and asked, more out of courtesy than expectation, whether he could demonstrate it. Johnston had come prepared. Two Navajo speakers stepped forward, Marines who had been briefed on nothing except the message they were about to convey. A simple English order was handed to one of them. He translated it instantly into Navajo and transmitted it across the room by field radio. Within seconds, the second Marine repeated it back in flawless English. The officers blinked. The speed alone defied their intuition. Codes required time. This required almost none. To test the claim, the Marines added observers, men trained in ciphers, deception nets, and cryptologic analysis. They leaned in, listening for recognizable phonetics or patterns, but the transmission rolled past them like a river without edges. There were no familiar anchors, no fragments to dissect. When it ended, none of the observers could identify even a single phrase. The silence that followed was different from courtesy. It was the slow recognition that an old assumption had broken, that perhaps the war's communication problem would not be solved by building a new machine, but by rediscovering a voice long overlooked. By the end of the meeting, the Marines approved a quiet experiment, unaware that this unorthodox idea would soon transform the very backbone of communication across the Pacific. When the Marine Corps agreed to test Johnston's proposal, its attention shifted toward a part of America the military had rarely acknowledged: the Navajo Nation. Stretching across the high desert of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, it was a sovereign culture rooted in traditions older than the United States itself. To many officers, it seemed distant from the machinery of modern war, but within its borders lived a linguistic world so deep, so carefully carried through generations, that it held the very qualities the Marines needed and could not manufacture. Navajo identity had always been shaped not by written record, but by spoken memory. Stories, prayers, and teachings formed a living archive passed from elder to child. The language itself mirrored the land, layered, resonant, and tied to a sacred geography of mountains, canyons, and the shifting path of seasons. Its grammar wove meaning into the smallest changes of tone. Its verbs could shift in ways that baffled even trained linguists. To outsiders, it was as unfathomable as the mesas on which it echoed. To those who grew up with it, it was the foundation of understanding the world. In 1942, very few non-Navajo Americans could speak the language at all. Fewer still could understand it with any precision. Scholars who attempted to categorize its syntax struggled to fit it into familiar linguistic families. Phonetic distinctions blurred under Western transcription systems. Tonal variations slipped past the ears of those untrained to hear them. In a nation shaped by English and standardized education, Navajo remained a world apart, resilient, intricate, and almost entirely untouched. It was this isolation that caught the military's attention. If they could find young Navajo men willing to serve, their speech might protect American operations more securely than any cipher wheel. And so, quietly and without public announcement, the Marines began traveling to schools, chapter houses, and trading posts across Navajo lands. They looked not for seasoned soldiers, but for youth, farmers who rose before dawn, shepherds who walked long miles with their flocks, students who balanced tribal tradition with the demands of federal education. Many were barely out of adolescence. Nearly all understood the weight of the decision placed before them. For some recruits, the arrival of Marine officers felt almost paradoxical. Many remembered hearing stories from their parents and grandparents, stories of government boarding schools where children were punished for speaking Navajo. Some had been told to abandon their language in order to fit into an America that seemed unwilling to hear them. The message had been clear. English was progress. Navajo was a barrier. And yet now, in the middle of a global war, the same government returned with urgency. It needed what it once dismissed. It sought the strength of the very voice it had tried to quiet. The young men who stepped forward did so with a calm gravity. They were not promised heroism. They were not told the full scope of what their service might become. But they understood that their language, carried through generations of resilience, was suddenly essential to the country they called home, and to the survival of Marines fighting thousands of miles away. Soon, buses and military trucks would carry them from the red earth of the Southwest to distant bases where a new experiment waited, an experiment that would test whether a nation within a nation could provide the code the Pacific War required. The Marine Corps entered the project with a sense of cautious optimism. They believed that if a code could be shaped from the Navajo language, structured, disciplined, and adapted for war, it might become something no enemy cryptologist could pursue. It was not a theory drawn from machines or mathematics. It was a wager on the uniqueness of human speech, on a linguistic world that had remained almost entirely outside the reach of global conflict. In an era defined by radio intercepts and mechanical ciphers, it felt almost radical. When the first 29 Navajo recruits arrived at Camp Pendleton in May 1942, many stepped onto the base with uncertainty. They had left behind sheep herds, small farms, classrooms, and trading posts, answering a call that came with few details. Some had never seen the ocean before. Some had never been far from their families' dryland cornfields. They knew only that their language was needed and that the Marine Corps expected them to serve in a way no recruits had served before. Their commanders wasted little time explaining the task. The war required a coded vocabulary, clear enough to transmit quickly under fire, yet unfamiliar enough that no Japanese analyst could unravel it. Each military term had to be reconstructed from the ground up. Aircraft, ships, ranks, map grids, weapons, and tactics all needed linguistic equivalents that fit within Navajo phonetics, yet remained recognizable to the men who would use them. It was a challenge that blended translation with invention. The recruits began working day and night in cramped rooms, filled with notebooks, chalkboards, and half-finished lists. They crafted terms that felt natural in Navajo, yet concealed meaning behind metaphor. A tank became chaidagahi, the turtle, a creature armored, low and slow-moving across the ground. A submarine became beshlo, the iron fish. A fighter aircraft became dahitihi, the hummingbird, small and swift in the sky. These choices were not poetic flourishes. They were tools designed to carry clarity and secrecy in equal measure. No Western cryptologic system resembled them. As the lexicon grew, so did the belief among officers that this code might offer an advantage mathematics alone had not. It did not rely on shifting alphabets or mechanical settings. It lived within the memory of the men who created it, shaped by a language that resisted reduction to symbols or formulas. The code's strength came from human nuance, from tones, inflections, and cultural logic that outsiders could not reproduce. What began as an experiment slowly became a doctrine. The Marines understood they were building more than a vocabulary. They were constructing a living cipher carried in the minds of young men who had once been told their language had no place in the modern world. Each new term added to the code felt like a quiet defiance of that old assumption. But the true test was still ahead. The lexicon existed on paper, and the recruits could speak it with precision. What remained unclear was whether this fragile new system, born from memory, metaphor, and necessity, could survive the chaos of combat. Throughout 1942 and into the early months of 1943, Japanese commanders carried themselves with a certainty that seemed unshakable. Their cryptologic units had dismantled the early Allied codes with a precision that impressed even their adversaries. Systems used by Chinese forces had fallen quickly. Dutch and British ciphers crumpled under sustained analysis, and the Americans, still struggling to modernize their communications, had offered no exception. Each victory reinforced a belief that Japan possessed an intellectual advantage the Allies could not match. Inside Tokyo's intelligence offices, this confidence hardened into doctrine. Officers reviewed past intercepts like trophies, reminders of a war that, in their view, was unfolding along predictable lines. If the Allies attempted to create a new code, Japanese analysts assumed they would break it just as they had broken the last. The radio war, they believed, belonged to them. In reports circulated through naval headquarters in 1943, intelligence officers predicted this dominance would continue unchallenged into the foreseeable future. Their assumptions contained a weakness invisible to those who held them. Japanese cryptology teams were built to confront systems shaped by Western logic, mathematical substitutions, alphabetic shifts, and the linguistic footprints of Indo-European languages. Their tools were designed for patterns. Their experience had taught them to expect structure. But the Pacific was far larger than the categories they trusted. Beyond the reach of their scholars lay languages they had never studied, languages that were not written, languages that carried centuries of complexity unrecorded by textbooks or analytical charts. When Japanese monitoring stations first heard the new transmissions coming from American lines, operators noted the clarity of the voices but could not identify their origin. The cadence did not match English. It did not match Tagalog, Cantonese, or any of the regional languages they had mapped. Analysts replayed fragments again and again, searching for recurring syllables, familiar tonal arcs, or the telltale fingerprints of code disguised as speech. Nothing fit. The recordings moved too quickly for dissection, yet too organically for artificial construction. And so the officers reached a comfortable conclusion. The Allies had engineered a cipher meant to sound like human conversation. In their eyes, this was merely a new branch of Western cryptographic experimentation, another challenge to be met with the same patience and mathematical discipline. If it behaved like a language, they reasoned, it could be treated like one, charted, broken apart, and mastered. That belief, so firmly held and rarely questioned, became its own limitation. Blind to the possibility that the sound might come from a living indigenous tongue unknown to their scholars, they misread the very nature of the problem. What they heard was not a mechanical disguise, but the voice of a people whose language existed far beyond the reach of conventional analysis. Behind marine lines, the breakthrough they dismissed was already taking shape, quietly, steadily, and with a momentum that would soon test every assumption Japan held about the war in the Pacific. The first 29 code talkers entered Marine Corps, training with a burden that no recruit before them had carried. They were expected to master every requirement of a frontline Marine: marksmanship, endurance, discipline, while simultaneously constructing a code system unlike anything the military had used. Each morning began like any other at Camp Pendleton: shouted commands, miles of running, and drills that left their muscles trembling. But when the other recruits rested, the Navajo men returned to cramped rooms where blackboards and radios filled the space meant for sleep. They were being shaped into something new, warriors whose voices would serve as weapons. Their responsibilities doubled with each passing week. In the eyes of the Corps, they were riflemen first, to be deployed into the most dangerous corners of the Pacific. Yet they were also cryptographers working in absolute secrecy, asked to create and refine a communication system capable of functioning under fire. The dual expectation weighed heavily. It was not enough to survive the battlefield. They were expected to carry the language of their people through it, unbroken and uncorrupted. The code they were building demanded a form of discipline no textbook could teach. Unlike traditional ciphers, their system could not exist on paper. Not a single notebook was allowed. No pocket references could accompany them into combat. All vocabulary, all terms, all metaphorical constructions had to be stored in memory alone. Each man carried hundreds of words in his mind, symbols for aircraft, ships, ranks, directions, strategies, and every one of them had to be recalled instantly, without hesitation. A moment lost in translation could cost a company its position. Senior Marine officers watched this experiment unfold with both admiration and doubt. They had seen how battles turned once chaos touched the radio lines. Could human memory remain reliable amid artillery blasts and sudden retreats? Could these young men, still adjusting to military life, maintain perfect recall when exhaustion blurred the sharp edges of thought? The officers worried that war might scatter their careful training like dust in the wind. The recruits felt pressure from more than one direction. Many had grown up hearing their elders speak of past attempts to silence Navajo culture, the boarding schools, the punishments against speaking their own language. Now they were being asked to depend on that language, to wield it as a shield for a nation that had not always treated them as equal partners. Their service became an act of duty, but also of reconciliation. They were navigating two identities: the traditions of their ancestors and the uniform of a military that needed them in ways it did not yet fully understand. As they refined the code, the Marines subjected them to relentless testing. Officers barked terms without warning, demanding translation within seconds. Radios crackled at all hours, forcing the men to respond mid-meal, mid-conversation, or half asleep. Accuracy was everything. If a term faltered, if a single metaphor slipped, they corrected it, reworked it, and committed it to memory again. Over time, error rates narrowed until they approached zero. The code became not just a system, but a living rhythm shared among them, a pulse of meaning they could feel as much as speak. Yet even as their confidence grew, quiet doubts lingered. In the private moments between drills, some wondered whether a handful of voices could genuinely influence the shape of a war, that stretched across thousands of miles. Could their language, spoken softly in childhood homes, withstand the scale of the Pacific conflict? Could it remain intact under the weight of responsibility that now rested on their shoulders? They did not voice these questions aloud, but the uncertainty sat with them like a shadow. Still, they continued. Each day honed their skill, each night welded memory into instinct, and gradually the recruits came to understand that they were not merely preparing a code, they were preparing themselves for the moment when that code would be tested under conditions none of them could yet imagine. Soon, radio silence would give way to the roar of battle, and the voices they had trained so carefully would face their first trial at war's edge. By late 1942, after months of training and secrecy, the first Navajo code talkers left the quiet scrublands of the American Southwest and stepped into the heat of the Pacific War. They deployed alongside the 1st Marine Division, men hardened by the desperate early battles, arriving at Guadalcanal with little ceremony. The island greeted them with the smell of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and distant gunfire. Here, the code they had memorized by lantern light would face its first true test. Within days of landing, the code talkers were assigned to frontline command posts scattered across the ridges and jungles of the island. Their radios crackled through heavy rain as they sent the first operational test messages over contested ground. The transmissions flowed in short, steady bursts, clear, rapid, and composed. Officers listening nearby found themselves stunned by the speed. What normally required minutes of encoding, checking, and transmission was now completed in seconds. The code did not slow the men down, it sharpened them. As the tempo of battle increased, the value of speed became unmistakable. During Japanese counterattacks, often sudden, violent, and launched from dense jungle canopies, every second counted. The code talkers relayed fire missions, troop movements, and urgent corrections with a fluidity no machine could match. Artillery batteries that once waited half an hour for confirmation could now respond in the space of a breath. Companies repositioned without hesitation. Units cut off along the Matanikau River reconnected through their voices, alone. Commanders began keeping informal tallies, comparing old procedures to the new. Messages that had once taken 30 minutes now averaged 20 seconds. The difference was not academic. It was measured in the number of Marines who survived night assaults, in patrols that reached their objectives before enemy forces regrouped, in lives preserved by the simple fact that clarity arrived faster than chaos. Quietly, without fanfare, the code talkers altered the rhythm of the entire division. Word spread through the ranks in the understated way soldiers share discoveries. Radio operators described the new messengers with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Officers observed that their accuracy approached perfection. Infantry Marines, who rarely cared about cryptography, cared deeply about anything that brought reinforcements or artillery at the right moment. And so, rumors traveled from foxhole to foxhole. Those Navajo Marines on the radios, whatever they were doing, were extraordinary. Across the waves, in Japanese listening stations positioned on nearby islands, the same transmissions were intercepted with full precision. Operators captured every syllable and logged each message carefully before forwarding them for analysis. They expected to decode them as they had decoded so many Allied communications before. But this time, the messages refused to yield. Patterns dissolved. Attempts at linguistic classification stalled. The transmissions sounded too natural to be artificial, yet too unfamiliar to belong to any known language family. Analysts argued among themselves, trying to fit the fragments into frameworks that no longer applied. What emerged was a paradox. The Japanese had perfect access to the signal, yet no access to its meaning. Their intelligence officers, accustomed to unraveling Allied codes within hours, now faced a wall without cracks. They could listen, but they could not understand. It was a new experience, one they did not publicly acknowledge, even to one another. Back on Guadalcanal, the Marines began to sense what they possessed. They had found an advantage the enemy could not replicate, a form of protection that grew stronger the more it was used. The code talkers continued to transmit through rainstorms, air raids, and sleepless nights, their calm voices steady against the tumult of battle. Each message carried the weight of their training and the irreducible strength of a language born far from the Pacific. But the true revelation was still taking shape. Guadalcanal was only the beginning. Ahead lay campaigns larger, bloodier, and more complex, stretches of ocean and island where the fate of entire divisions would depend on speed, clarity, and the unbreakable code carried in the memories of these young Marines. As the battles of 1943 intensified and the first successes of the Navajo code talkers echoed through the Marine Corps, a quiet realization took hold among senior commanders. The original group of 29 would not be enough. The war was widening across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. Each new operation demanded more radios, more relay points, more voices capable of speaking a language the enemy could not touch. And so, the Marines returned to Navajo country, recruiting young men who had never imagined that their fluency, once discouraged in classrooms, would become essential to the machinery of war. With every new arrival, the code expanded beyond its original dictionary. The early vocabulary, built under the pressures of Camp Pendleton, had served Guadalcanal well, but larger operations required more precision, more depth, and more ways to disguise meaning. The code talkers refined the system in ways no conventional cipher had ever needed. Instead of single terms for each letter, they created 3 alternatives, ensuring that even if the Japanese intercepted large volumes of traffic, patterns would dissolve before they could be charted. Weapons gained multiple metaphors. Machine guns described not only as Nima-si, the rapid-fire gun, but by other images that carried subtle nuance within the Navajo worldview. The language breathed, shifting easily between meanings. The Marines tested these refinements under conditions as close to battle as training could allow. Radios blared during simulated artillery barrages. In night exercises, the men transmitted without moonlight, their words steady despite the disorientation of darkness. During amphibious landing drills, they sent messages waist-deep in surf, holding radios above the waves, while officers timed every response. Across thousands of transmissions, errors remained nearly non-existent. What the recruits had forged through repetition now held firm against chaos. Commanders took notice. Divisional leaders who had once questioned whether human memory could sustain a battlefield code now requested code talkers by name. Soon, the Marines embedded Navajo operators into every major regiment, placing them not only at headquarters but within companies moving under fire. Their voices formed strands of connection across broken terrain, ravines in Bougainville, coral ridges in New Britain, and the dense jungles that hid enemy positions with deceptive silence. As their presence increased, the system evolved into something larger than any one unit. It became a lattice of communication, linking battalions through a shared language that no outsider could penetrate. Messages raced from forward observers to artillery batteries, from rifle companies to regimental command posts, all carried by Navajo operators who translated with a precision born of both training and cultural memory. The Marine Corps, long defined by its aggressive infantry doctrine, found itself strengthened by an invisible architecture of sound. Even Allied units outside the Marines began to take notice. Army commanders preparing for joint operations requested code talkers for their own communications networks. Navy units coordinating fire support recognized the reliability and speed the system offered. The requests traveled upward until headquarters acknowledged what the lower ranks already knew. The Navajo code had become a strategic asset, one capable of shaping operations across entire theaters. By 1944, as American forces pressed westward through the Central Pacific, Navajo voices formed the nervous system of the island-hopping strategy. Their transmissions guided landings at Cape Gloucester, directed movements across the Green Islands, and coordinated assaults on Saipan and Tinian. In every operation, the same pattern emerged: rapid messages, flawless accuracy, and complete security. The Japanese continued to intercept every signal with perfect clarity and perfect confusion. Yet the greatest test of the code still lay ahead, on islands where the fighting would reach levels of intensity the Marines had not yet encountered. And as the Navajo operators refined their craft, none could entirely foresee how vital their voices would soon become. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered a new and brutal phase. Saipan, an island of jagged ridges, cane fields, and fortified caves, stood as one of Japan's most heavily defended positions in the Central Pacific. To take it would place American long-range bombers within reach of the Japanese home islands. To fail would extend the war indefinitely. Every commander who approached its shores understood the weight of the operation. And among the Marines packed into landing craft on June 15, 1944, were Navajo code talkers whose voices would soon shape the battle in ways no one had fully anticipated. The first waves hit the beaches under sheets of artillery fire. Japanese guns, concealed in cliffs and ravines, fired with lethal accuracy into the congested landing zones. Smoke drifted low across the water, and the roar of machine guns drowned out every other sound. Amid this violence, code talkers crouched beside their radios, shielding their sets from seawater as they began transmitting the first coordinates of the invasion. Their voices remained steady, unbroken by the chaos around them. In a battle measured by seconds, they delivered information with a precision that cut through the disorder of the beachhead. As Marines fought to gain footholds inland, the code talkers became the connective tissue of the assault. Forward observers relayed enemy artillery positions to them from shattered dunes and burning cane fields. Within moments, those coordinates were translated, transmitted, and acted upon. Batteries offshore adjusted their fire. Air support altered its attack runs. Tank crews maneuvered through terrain they could not see, guided by a language the enemy could not penetrate. What had once taken precious minutes now arrived almost instantly, a flow of intelligence uninterrupted by mechanical encoding or decoding. Japanese officers, listening from hidden posts, intercepted every transmission. The clarity of the voices misled them. They expected to identify patterns or repeated phrases, clues that would reveal the structure of the code. Instead, the transmissions behaved like dialogue, fluid, natural, and impossible to dissect. Analysts argued that it must be an advanced cipher disguised as speech, an American machine yet to be understood. Their confidence, once so absolute, became a barrier. Unable to imagine a human origin for such a system, they searched for solutions in the wrong direction. During the fighting, American forces captured a Japanese intelligence officer whose unit had been tasked with analyzing the mysterious transmissions. Under questioning, he made a rare admission. There was no possible method to break the American radio code. His analysts had tried frequency charts, phonetic comparisons, and cross-referencing with every language family they knew. Nothing fit. The voices seemed to come from a world beyond their charts and textbooks, untethered to any form they recognized. On the ground, the code talkers' effectiveness became impossible to ignore. During a Japanese night attack that threatened to split 2 Marine battalions, their rapid transmissions directed emergency artillery fire that sealed a gap in the line. Men who had been moments from being overrun found themselves supported by barrages, arriving exactly when and where they were needed. Officers later traced those life-saving corrections to a single Navajo operator who maintained flawless communication under the glare of flares and the crack of rifle fire. As the battle moved inland, the pattern continued. The more complex the operation became, the more indispensable the code talkers proved. Commanders began building their tactics around the speed and reliability of the Navajo code, trusting it in moments when hesitation could unravel the entire assault. The system no longer felt experimental, it felt foundational. By the time Saipan fell in July 1944, the outcome carried significance far beyond the island itself. For the first time, the U.S. military grasped the full extent of what the code talkers had created. Their language had not merely improved communication, it had transformed it, turning radios into instruments of near-instant coordination and stripping the enemy of their most trusted advantage. Saipan revealed a new truth. The war's momentum was shifting, carried forward in part by voices the enemy could hear but never understand. And ahead lay islands where that advantage would become even more critical. By February 1945, the war had reached the black sands of Iwo Jima, an island smaller than many American towns, yet fortified with such precision that commanders understood it would be the most dangerous amphibious landing of the Pacific campaign. Beneath its volcanic ridges lay a labyrinth of tunnels carved by hand, defended by soldiers determined to inflict maximum casualties. The Marines who approached the island on the morning of February 19th carried the weight of this awareness, knowing the cost that awaited them. Among them were Navajo code talkers, whose radios would soon become lifelines, in a place where visibility vanished within minutes of landing. The first waves stepped onto beaches of ash so soft it swallowed their boots. Japanese artillery, concealed in hidden embrasures, waited until the shoreline filled with Marines before opening fire. Shells exploded with terrifying accuracy, sending shockwaves across the landing zones. Amid the smoke and chaos, code talkers dropped into shallow depressions in the sand, shielding their radios from shrapnel as they began transmitting. Their voices remained composed even as the air shook around them. Within the first hours, they relayed fire missions, casualty reports, and urgent requests for reinforcements faster than commanders could have imagined. As the battle pushed inland, the demands on communication intensified. The Japanese tunnel network made enemy positions nearly impossible to locate. Units disappeared into smoke-filled ravines and re-emerged at unexpected angles, often cut off from supporting fire. Yet the code talkers worked without pause, transmitting thousands of messages in the first 48 hours alone, each one delivered without a single error. Forward observers shouted coordinates over the roar of flamethrowers, and within seconds, artillery batteries adjusted their fire. Tanks maneuvered through narrow corridors of volcanic rock, guided by instructions sent with a clarity no machine-encoded message could have achieved. Officers began to grasp the full scale of what the code talkers were accomplishing. In memoranda and after-action reports, commanders noted that the rapid transmissions prevented breakdowns in coordination that could have collapsed the beachhead entirely. One regimental commander later put the truth plainly. Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. It was not a flourish of praise. It was a sober assessment drawn from the harrowing first days of the assault. Japanese radio units, aware of the increasing tempo of American communication, attempted to counter it with every method available. They flooded channels with static. They broadcast false commands. They recorded entire sequences of Navajo transmissions and sent them to specialists on nearby islands. Yet even with perfect audio quality, they remained locked outside the meaning. The cadence sounded human, but the structure refused classification. Analysts searched for mechanical signatures and found none. What they faced was a system carried entirely in memory, unwritten, unfamiliar, and unyielding. As the Marines advanced toward Mount Suribachi and the northern defenses, the code talkers became part of the island's hidden architecture. Their voices directed the destruction of tunnel networks that had cost hundreds of lives. They coordinated air support during moments when forward units lacked visibility. They kept battalions synchronized through smoke, dust, and the constant thunder of artillery. In a battle where every yard gained came at staggering cost, their speed reduced confusion, the deadliest enemy of all. Across the front, the turning point emerged not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of proof. The code was not merely secure, it was unassailable. Japanese intelligence could intercept every syllable, yet never unlock its meaning. Commanders could shift tactics instantly, confident the enemy would remain blind to their intentions. Radios ceased to feel like vulnerabilities. For the first time in the Pacific War, they became instruments of absolute advantage. And as the last pockets of resistance on the island fell, the Marines understood that what had happened on Iwo Jima was larger than the battle itself. They had witnessed the power of a language that had traveled from the high desert of the American Southwest to the heart of the Pacific's most brutal fighting, and had carried them through it. Ahead lay Okinawa, and with it, the final proving ground for a code the enemy could hear but never break. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had reached Okinawa, the last and largest proving ground before any assault on Japan itself. The island stretched 48 miles from end to end, its ridgelines carved into defensive belts that turned every advance into a siege. Rain swept across the beaches in gray sheets, mixing with smoke from burning villages and the constant rumble of naval bombardment. Into this crucible stepped the Navajo code talkers. No longer new recruits or experimental operators, but seasoned Marines whose instincts had been sharpened through years of battle. From the first days of the landing, their radios never fell silent. Air, naval, and ground units converged on Okinawa in one of the largest amphibious operations of the entire war. More than 180,000 American troops, supported by fleets that stretched across the horizon. Coordinating this vast machinery required communication at a tempo that ordinary codes could not sustain. Yet for the code talkers, the rhythm had become second nature. They transmitted fire missions to ships offshore, relayed air support requests to carrier pilots circling above the clouds, and linked battalions moving through the muck of torrential rain. What had once been an experiment had become the backbone of operational control. Across the island, Japanese commanders attempted to classify the strange language that cut through their intercept stations. Analysts replayed captured transmissions late into the night, searching for patterns in the short bursts of syllables. They compared them to regional languages, to Pacific dialects, even to obscure tongues collected in pre-war linguistic surveys. Nothing aligned. The phonetics twisted beyond their categories, and the tonal shifts offered no repetition to grasp. The language resisted every tool they used. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that they were listening to a system designed precisely to avoid classification. American commanders, fully aware of this advantage, began planning operations with the code talkers at the center, rather than the margins. Their speed enabled fire coordination across distances that had previously been too slow to exploit. When attacking the Shuri Line, the heavily fortified heart of the island, Division headquarters relied on Navajo transmissions to synchronize assaults on multiple ridges at once. Messages that once took minutes now moved in heartbeats, enabling strategies that hinged on timing far tighter than conventional crypto systems allowed. In the chaos of Okinawa's close-quarters combat, friendly fire posed a constant danger. Smoke, rain, and shifting fronts made identification difficult even in daylight. Code talkers repeatedly issued warnings that prevented catastrophic mistakes, redirecting artillery that had been plotted too close to friendly positions, halting airstrikes when units unexpectedly advanced, and clarifying coordinates that had been muffled by static. Their precision saved Marines who never learned the names of the voices that protected them. Japanese forces, struggling to hold their lines, attempted rapid redeployments during American breakthroughs, yet the Navajo code outpaced them. While Japanese units moved through tunnels and ravines, the code talkers relayed the changes instantly across multiple battalions. Commanders exploited these vulnerabilities before the enemy could stabilize. It was not simply that the Japanese could not decipher the messages. It was that the Americans could act faster than Japanese intelligence could even react. Communication itself had become a strategic weapon. As the battle stretched on for 82 days, one of the longest and bloodiest in the Pacific, the code talkers continued to work with the same patient discipline they had learned in their earliest training. They spoke through exhaustion, through artillery blasts that shook their radios from the dirt, through nights lit only by muzzle flashes and the eerie glow of flares drifting across the sky. Where the terrain separated units, their voices held the lines together. Where confusion threatened to turn the battle inward, their clarity restored order. By the final months of the war, their reliability had become legend among the officers who relied on them. Reports from Okinawa emphasized not just the security of the code, but the instinctive professionalism of the men who carried it. Their transmissions no longer felt like an advantage. They felt indispensable. In a theater defined by distance and unpredictability, the code talkers formed the most trusted instrument of coordination the Marines possessed. And as Okinawa fell, commanders knew that whatever came next, whether invasion, blockade, or negotiation, their voices would shape the last movements of a war that had consumed half the world. When August 1945 arrived, it did not bring the sudden peace many had imagined. The news of Japan's surrender moved across the Pacific in uneven waves. Some heard it through radio static, others through the exhausted voices of officers reading official orders. For the Navajo code talkers, scattered across islands from Peleliu to Okinawa, the announcement felt both distant and strangely unreal. They had spent years speaking in urgency, translating in seconds, shaping the outcome of battles through messages that moved faster than danger itself. Now, with the guns falling silent, the world they had helped secure shifted without them. Yet even as the uniforms relaxed and weapons were stacked for shipment home, the code talkers received an order unlike any given to other Marines. They were told they could not speak of what they had done, not to reporters, not to fellow veterans, not even to their families. The code, still considered vital to national security, remained classified. Every message they had sent, every fire mission they had coordinated, every night they had held a line together, none of it could be mentioned. Their story ended not with a parade, but with a promise of silence. In the weeks after demobilization, trains carried them back across the country, leaving behind the humid air of the Pacific for the dry wind of the Southwest. Many returned to reservations that had changed little since the day they left. electricity remained unreliable. Roads washed out after storms. Schools operated with minimal resources. For some, the transition was jarring. They had orchestrated assaults across entire divisions, yet stepped off the bus into communities where their service was barely recorded, let alone understood. There were no banners, no welcoming speeches, only family members who embraced them without knowing the full measure of what they had endured. They resumed the work that had shaped their early lives. Some returned to sheep herding, waking before dawn to guide flocks through familiar pastures. Others repaired fences, harvested crops, or entered small trading posts to look for employment. A few, carrying physical wounds from the war, faced a quieter struggle with the ghosts of battle. Sounds that replayed in memory, flashes of radio static that seemed to carry echoes of danger long after the conflict ended. Through all of this, they carried their silence with the same steady discipline they had shown on the radio. At home, questions naturally arose. Children asked what their fathers had done overseas. Neighbors asked why they had been sent so far from home. Some tried to guess, believing they had simply served as ordinary radio operators or infantry marines. The code talkers answered politely but vaguely, offering fragments of routine without revealing what lay beneath. Their silence became a second form of duty, a continuation of service after the uniform had been folded and put away. They had once protected a code under fire. Now they protected it in everyday life, against curiosity and innocent questions. Across the United States, victory celebrations unfolded with all the public enthusiasm the war had denied for so long. Parades filled city streets, newspapers printed lists of heroes, politicians spoke proudly of strategy and sacrifice. Yet nowhere, except in a handful of classified military files, was there mention of the Navajo men who had transmitted the messages that made many of those victories possible. Their contribution remained invisible, buried beneath layers of secrecy that would endure for decades. In military archives, after-action reports from Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were sorted into folders and stored in steel cabinets. Some contained brief lines praising communication efficiency, others noted unbreakable transmissions, but few identified the source directly. Even historians tasked with writing official accounts of the Pacific War often lacked access to the classified material. The Navajo voices that had once moved across radios with such clarity were now confined to documents no one else could read. Still, the code talkers carried the knowledge quietly, with a mixture of pride and restraint. They understood that victory had depended not only on weapons and strategy, but on moments when their words had arrived at precisely the right time. They remembered nights when artillery fire changed direction because of a message they delivered, or days when entire companies advanced safely because the enemy could not understand what was being said. The impact of those transmissions still echoed through the military records locked away in vaults far from their homes. As the years passed, many code talkers aged into anonymity. They attended community gatherings, raised families, built homes, and lived through seasons of drought and renewal. A few spoke at schools or chapter houses about their experiences as Marines, but even then, the most critical details remained unspoken. They lived in the quiet space between extraordinary service and ordinary life, a space defined not by recognition, but by responsibility. Their silence did not diminish what they had done. If anything, it added a deeper weight to their contribution. While the nation celebrated victory without knowing their names, the code talkers preserved the integrity of the very system that had helped secure that victory. They waited, year after year, for the day their story could finally be told, the day when secrecy would lift, and the world would learn what had been carried in their voices across the Pacific. And in archives, thousands of miles from their homes, the records of their transmissions remained untouched, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally emerge. For more than 2 decades after the war, the story of the Navajo code talkers remained sealed behind layers of classification. Veterans returned to their communities carrying the weight of what they had done, yet unable to explain even the outlines of their service. Historians published volumes on the Pacific Campaign without mentioning the code. Cryptologists who studied wartime signals saw unexplained gaps in the Japanese intercept record, moments where American communications seemed to defy analysis, but they lacked the clearance to understand why. The silence endured long enough that an entire generation grew up unaware that the war had once hinged on a language spoken by fewer than 100,000 people. Only in 1968 did the U.S. government finally declassify the Navajo Code Talker program. By then, the world had changed. New conflicts had risen, new technologies had reshaped intelligence work, and the memories of the Pacific War had begun slipping into history. The announcement came quietly, tucked into military releases rather than national headlines. But for those who had served in the program, it marked the first moment when they could speak openly about the burden they had carried alone. As the news spread, veterans' organizations began reaching out to the men whose roles had been hidden for so long. Interviews were arranged in chapter houses on the Navajo Nation, in small living rooms shaded by curtains, in VA halls where aging Marines gathered to share stories that had once stayed unspoken. Researchers sifted through surviving unit reports and field logs. Slowly, a clearer picture emerged, not of a small contribution, but of a system central to the Pacific War itself. Historians pieced together the volume of transmissions the code talkers had sent, more than 800,000 messages over the course of the conflict, all delivered without a single documented error. The statistic was staggering. No other communication system in the war, mechanical or human, had matched that level of reliability. It reflected not only the structure of the code, but the discipline of the men who carried it in memory through exhaustion, hunger, and danger. Cryptologists, now free to discuss the program openly, offered assessments that reshaped the understanding of wartime communication. They confirmed that the Navajo Code had never been broken, not partially, not tentatively, not even at the level of pattern recognition. It stood as one of the very few unbroken codes of the entire war. Even decades later, specialists in linguistics and encryption marveled at its construction, a system built not by machines or academic theorists, but by young Marines who had woven cultural metaphor into military necessity with instinctive precision. As the story spread, public ceremonies began to emerge, belated gestures of acknowledgement for men whose work had once been hidden even from their own families. In Washington, D.C., officials presented medals and commendations, attempting to repair the long gap between service and recognition. Community celebrations blossomed across the Navajo Nation as elders who had once kept silent finally shared fragments of their experiences with grandchildren who listened in awe. Yet these ceremonies were shadowed by the passage of time. Many of the original 29 code talkers, the men who had built the first lexicon under the pressure of looming battle, had already passed away before their contributions became known. Their absence lingered in every tribute. Photographs of young Marines were displayed on tables beside empty chairs that symbolized stories now lost forever. The nation was learning their history only after many of its central voices had fallen silent. As historians revised their accounts of the Pacific War, a shift began to take hold. Battles long analyzed through the lenses of strategy and firepower were now understood through the added dimension of communication, the quiet architecture that allowed those strategies to function. Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were re-examined with a new understanding that the speed and security of Navajo communication had not merely supported operations, but in many cases made them possible. Recognition arrived, but it carried a measure of regret. The honors were real, the gratitude sincere, yet always touched by the knowledge that they had come too late for many who had earned them. The silence that had protected the code had also obscured its creators, leaving them unacknowledged during the years when their voices could have shaped public memory. Still, the belated recognition ensured that their legacy would not disappear again. The truth, once buried, had finally emerged into the light, changing the nation's understanding of the war and honoring those whose words had once traveled across the Pacific with the power to shape history. In the decades since the Pacific War faded from living memory, the story of the Navajo code talkers has taken on a clarity that was impossible during the conflict itself. What once existed only in classified files and scattered recollections is now understood as one of the rare moments in military history when cultural heritage became a form of technology, an instrument of survival, born not from laboratories or factories, but from tradition carried across generations. Their achievement stands as a reminder that innovation sometimes emerges not from invention, but from rediscovery. The Navajo language, long suppressed, dismissed, and nearly erased through government policy, became a shield that protected thousands of American lives. In an era when the world raced to build faster machines and more complex encryption devices, the code talkers revealed that an unbroken chain of oral memory could outperform every cipher wheel and decoding room the war had produced. Each message they sent traveled through a linguistic world shaped by ancestors who had never imagined their words would one day form a barrier against foreign armies. Yet that is precisely what happened. Historians now rank their contribution alongside the most decisive innovations of the Pacific Campaign. Radar, amphibious tactics, and long-range aviation changed the battlefield. But the speed and security of Navajo communication changed the tempo of entire operations, sometimes by minutes, sometimes by seconds, but always in ways that shaped outcomes. Intelligence officers who once studied the war through the lens of strategy alone have come to understand that the success of Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa was inseparable from the messages that flowed through Navajo radios, guiding units across terrain where visibility collapsed and certainty vanished. Their story revealed a deeper truth as well, that strength can emerge from sources no nation expects. The United States, like every wartime power, had assumed that the decisive tools of victory would come from its industrial base and its scientific institutions. Instead, one of its most effective weapons came from a community the government had marginalized for generations. The irony is profound. A language once punished in classrooms became essential to defeating an empire that prided itself on its mastery of code breaking. The code itself remains a symbol of resilience, proof that human memory, shaped by culture and reinforced by discipline, can withstand pressures that technology cannot. The complexity of Navajo grammar, the fluidity of its metaphors, the cadence that shifted meaning with the slightest change in tone. These qualities became the foundation of a communication system that no enemy could penetrate. It was an achievement rooted not in secrecy alone, but in identity. When the code talkers spoke across the radios of Saipan or Iwo Jima, they carried with them the memory of their families, their stories, and their land. The code was never simply a military tool. It was an expression of who they were. Today, the world remembers their courage with a mixture of admiration and humility. Museums display their radios, Schools teach their history. Ceremonies honor the men whose voices once guided divisions through firestorms of steel. And yet, beneath every commemoration lies the quiet awareness of something more personal, that these men served a nation that had not always served them in return. Their contribution forces a re-evaluation, not only of the war, but of the assumptions that shaped the country before and after it. The irony remains unmistakable. The Pacific War, fought with carriers stretching the length of city blocks and machines that filled entire rooms, was transformed by voices, transmitted through simple microphones, not artificial signals, not engineered frequencies, but human speech, living, flexible, unbroken. The weapons designed by physicists and strategists defined the war's outer boundaries. The voices of the code talkers shaped what happened inside them. The code talkers never expected any of this. They did not imagine that their childhood language, spoken at kitchen tables and in sheep camps, would one day shape the largest oceanic conflict in history. They did not expect that divisions would depend on their words, or that commanders would map their operations around the speed of transmissions born on the mesas of the Southwest. And they certainly did not expect that historians, decades later, would describe their contribution as one of the most extraordinary achievements of the war. But history has a way of revealing the truth long after the battle's end. The Navajo code talkers did not rewrite the war through force or destruction. They rewrote it through clarity, through messages carried with precision at moments when clarity meant survival. Their voices once echoed through the jungles of Guadalcanal, across the ridges of Saipan, into the tunnels of Iwo Jima, and over the rain-soaked hills of Okinawa. Today they echo still, quiet reminders of a time when ingenuity rose from tradition, when memory outperformed machines, and when a language nearly lost became a lifeline for a nation at war.